военной операции.
Не так! Welcome to Ukraine, сука!
The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, initiated in February 2022, was predictated on a set of doctrinal assumptions that proved catastrophically disconnected from reality. This video will provide a comprehensive analysis of the Russian military's strategic failures up to September 2025, contrasting its pre-war military theory with its operational and tactical performance. The essential finding is that the war has exposed a systematic failure within the Russian military institution, revealing a profound chasm between its ambitious, modern doctrine and its demonstrated inability to execute complex, combined arms warfare. After more than 3.5 years of high-intensity conflict, the front lines have settled into a grinding war of attrition, with marginal Russian gains coming at an unsustainable cost in personnel and materiel. Russia's pre-war doctrine, a complex amalgamation of Soviet-era concepts like deep battle and modern theories of active defense and hybrid warfare, envisioned a swift, decisive campaign that would paralyze the Ukrainian state and achieve its political objective within days. The reality has been a protracted struggle, characterized by a series of high-profile operational debacles. This video details these failures through a systematic analysis of material losses, human costs, and strategic embarrassments. The visually confirmed losses of over 22,000 pieces of major military equipment and estimated casualties exceeding 1 million personnel represent a decimation of Russia's pre-war conventional forces. Key operational failures, such as the disastrous assault on Kyiv, the persistent inability to achieve air superiority, and the humiliating loss of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, cruiser Moskva, are examined as case studies of systematic dysfunction. These were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a cascading collapse, where failures in intelligence, logistics, command and control, and combined arms coordination reinforced one another. Ultimately, the war has been a strategic own goal of historic proportions. It has failed to achieve its political aims, unified and strengthened the NATO alliance, and crippled Russia's economy. Most significantly, it has shattered the myth of Russian military power, the Kremlin's most potent foreign policy instrument. The perception of its formidable conventional army has been irrevocably devalued. The war has exposed the Russian military as a hollowed-out Potemkin force, leaving Russia a diminished power on the world stage, reliant on its nuclear arsenal as the last vestige of its great power status. As of September 2025, the war in Ukraine is defined by a grinding, attritional character. Russia maintains the strategic initiative, dictating the tempo and location of most offensive actions, but it is proven incapable of translating this into operational level breakthroughs. The front line, stretching over 1,000 kilometers, is largely static, with territorial changes measured in meters per day, at a staggering cost in human lives and equipment. Russia currently occupies approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory, a figure that's seen only marginal changes over the past year, despite continuous offensive pressure. Russian military's main effort is unequivocally focused on the complete seizure of Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine. Intense, attritional fighting is concentrated around key strategic objectives, such as Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, as well as along the Kupiansk-Lyman line in Luhansk and Kharkiv Oblast. The prioritization of this axis is evident in the redeployment of Russia's more capable remaining units, including elements of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade and various airborne formations, to reinforce these offensive operations. Despite official Russian claims of capturing hundreds of square kilometers monthly, these tactical gains have not led to a collapse of Ukrainian defensive lines or the capture of a single major city in over a year. Operations along the northern axis, Kharkiv and Sumy Oblast, and the southern axis, Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast, have been relegated to supporting efforts. In the north, Russian actions are primarily shaping operations designed to fix Ukrainian forces, preventing their redeployment to the Donbass and to create a buffer zone. The southern front is characterized by positional warfare, intense artillery duels, and persistent Ukrainian efforts to disrupt Russian ground lines of communication through long-range strikes. The battlefield of 2025 bears little resemblance to the one envisioned in pre-war doctrine. The Battalion tactical group, once touted as the centerpiece of Russian combined arms warfare, is effectively defunct, having been proven too fragile and logistically cumbersome in the early phases of the war. The battlefield of 2025 bears little resemblance to the one envisioned in pre-war Doctrine. The Battalion Tactical Group, otherwise known as BTG, once touted as the centerpiece of Russian combined arms warfare, is effectively defunct, having been proven too fragile and logistically cumbersome in the early phase of the war. In its place, Russian forces have evolved to far simpler tactics. The primary offensive maneuver now consists of small, dismounted infantry assaults, typically comprising just 3 to 5 soldiers. These groups often utilize motorcycles or light all-terrain vehicles for rapid, low-signature movement to the line of contact, where they attempt to infiltrate Ukrainian positions. This tactical shift is not a sign of innovative thinking, but rather a forced adaptation to 2 critical realities. The first, the catastrophic loss of armoured vehicles, which makes large-scale mechanized assaults costly, and secondly, the destruction of the professional non-commissioned officer corps, which has eliminated the leadership cadre necessary to coordinate complex operations. The dominant feature of the modern Ukrainian battlefield is the ubiquitous presence of unmanned systems. The airspace is saturated with a constant churn of reconnaissance drones, which provide unprecedented battlefield transparency, and first-person view attack drones, which deliver cheap, precision-guided munitions against any target. This hyperlethal environment has rendered large concentrations of troops or vehicles exceedingly vulnerable, forcing the dispersal of forces and driving a relentless technological arms race in drone capabilities, electronic warfare, and counter-drone systems. Russia's ability to sustain the high-attrition war is underpinned by a full transition to a war economy and critical material support from its few allies, most notably North Korea, which has supplied millions of desperately needed artillery shells. This has allowed Russia to maintain a significant, albeit low-quality advantage in artillery firepower. However, this effort is not without strain. Western-led sanctions and a sustained Ukrainian deep strike campaign against Russian oil refineries have created significant economic pressure and domestic fuel shortages. In the information space, the Kremlin continues to project a narrative of inevitable victory, aiming to erode Western political will and support for Ukraine, even as the realities on the ground paint a picture of a costly stalemate. This operational stalemate has transformed the conflict into a direct contest of industrial capacity and coalition resolve, with neither side currently able to generate the combat power necessary to achieve a decisive military victory. The outcome is increasingly dependent on a simple but brutal calculus of attrition. Which side can better sustain and replace its losses in personnel and material? To comprehend the full scale of Russia's failure in Ukraine, it is essential to first understand the theoretical framework that was supposed to guide its actions. Modern Russian military thought prior to 2022 was a sophisticated, multi-layered construct that blended Soviet legacy concepts with adaptations for 21st century warfare. However, this doctrinal edifice was built upon a foundation of contradictions and flawed assumptions. The strategic framework of active defense. The capstone of Russian strategic thought was the concept of active defense, developed for a potential large-scale conflict where Russia would likely be the conventionally weaker party, i.e. against NATO. This doctrine eschewed the costly seizure of territory as a primary objective. Instead, its theory of victory was premised on degrading the adversary's military, economic potential, and will to continue the fight. This would be achieved through a combination of preemptive actions and a wartime strategy focused on long-range precision strikes against the enemy's critically important objects, for example, command nodes, logistical hubs, energy infrastructure. The goal was to inflict such damage that the opponent would be forced to seek war termination on terms favorable to Russia, all while preserving Russia's own forces from annihilation in costly frontal assaults. Beneath this strategic umbrella, Russian operational art remained heavily influenced by the Soviet concept of deep battle. This theory was designed to avoid attritional stalemates by conducting operations throughout the entire depth of the enemy's defenses simultaneously. A deep operation envisaged using massed combined arms formations to achieve a narrow breakthrough, which would then be exploited by fresh mobile forces driving deep into the enemy's operational rear to induce a complete paralysis and collapse of the front. Speed, mass, and surprise were the critical components of this highly offensive concept. In the 21st century, Russian military thinkers integrated these conventional concepts with a modern understanding of conflict that blurred the lines between war and peace. This approach became widely known in the West as the Gerasimov Doctrine. Following a 2013 article by the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, this conceptualization of modern conflict persists that non-military means, political, economic, informational, and diplomatic, have a role equal to or even greater than military force in achieving strategic objectives, suggesting a 4-to-1 ratio of non-military to military actions. The goal is to destabilize an adversary from within, creating favorable conditions before the overt use of military force, which is applied only at the final stage to secure victory. The VDV as a strategic instrument. Within this framework, a special role was reserved for the elite airborne forces, the VDV. The VDV was not merely elite infantry, but a strategic instrument of the high command, designed to act as the spearhead in a deep operation. Doctrinally, they were to be employed in daring vertical envelopments, inserted via air assault deep behind enemy lines to seize critical objectives such as airfields and government centres, thereby paralysing the state's command and control and facilitating a rapid victory. However, the Kremlin's overconfidence in the not-so-elite VDV led to a fatal strategic miscalculation. Russian leaders appeared to genuinely believe that the non-military phase of the conflict against Ukraine had already been won. They viewed Ukraine through the distorted lens of the Gerasimov Doctrine, seeing it as not a unified nation, but as a fragile state ready to collapse. This flawed intelligence assessment led to the assumption that the initial invasion would be a rapid police action, not a full-scale war. The collision between Russia's ambitious military doctrine and the unforgiving reality of the Ukrainian battlefield produced a military disaster of a scale not seen in Europe since 1945. The failures were not confined to a single domain, but were systemic, cascading across every level of war. Combined arms operations, systematic failure, inability to synchronize fires, maneuver, and air support. Isolated armor and mechanized columns were destroyed piecemeal during the Kyiv offensive and later at Volodar. The BTG concept proved too complex for the Russian command structure to manage effectively, leading to its abandonment in favor of simplified infantry assaults. Air superiority, total failure. The Russian aerospace forces failed to conduct effective suppression of enemy air defenses in the opening days of the war. This critical failure prevented Russia from ever establishing air superiority, exposing its ground forces to attack and forcing the VKS to rely on standoff weapons. Deep battle and decisive speed, complete collapse. The foundational concept of a rapid, deep penetration to achieve operational paralysis failed within the first 72 hours. The VDV's failure at Hostomel, coupled with catastrophic logistical shortfalls, turned the planned lightning strike on Kyiv into a static slog that ended in a humiliating retreat. Role of the VDV, decimation of elite forces. Doctrinally, the strategic spearhead, the VDV was misused as elite light infantry in frontal assaults, for example in Hostomel and Bakhmut. They suffered devastating losses, effectively destroying the best trained component of the pre-war Russian army. Logistics and sustainment, structural weaknesses exposed. The invasion revealed a logistics system critically over-reliant on railways and lacking the truck transport to sustain mobile operations. This was a primary cause of the Kyiv offensive failure and remains a persistent constraint. Information and hybrid warfare, strategic self-deception. The belief that non-military means had already destabilized Ukraine led to a fatally flawed invasion plan based on the assumption of minimal resistance. The information campaign failed to win over the Ukrainian population or prevent the consolidation of Western support. Material losses, the decimation of an arsenal. The scale of Russia's material losses is staggering. Based on conservative, open-source intelligence that relies exclusively on photographic or videographic evidence, Russia's losses of major equipment exceeded 22,600 units. This figure, while certainly an undercount of the true total, paints a picture of industrial-scale destruction. The losses in armoured combat vehicles have been particularly severe. As of September 2025, visually confirmed losses include over 4,100 tanks and a total of more than 13,100 armoured fighting vehicles. These numbers represent a significant portion of Russia's pre-war active inventory of modern equipment. This has forced the Russian military to reach deep into its Cold War-era strategic storage, reactivating and deploying thousands of obsolete T-62 and T-55 tanks, platforms that offer their crews minimal protection on the battlefield. This degradation in equipment quality has a direct and negative impact on combat effectiveness and crew survivability. The human cost. A Pyrrhic generation. The material cost of the war is matched by its devastating human costs. While the Russian Federation classifies its casualty figures, estimates from Western intelligence agencies converge on a figure that is nothing short of catastrophic. By mid-2025, total Russian casualties, encompassing those killed, wounded, missing, or captured, are assessed to have surpassed the 1 million mark. The number of personnel killed in action is estimated to be as high as 250,000. In just over 3 years, Russia has suffered approximately 15 times more fatalities than the Soviet Union did during its decade-long war in Afghanistan. The initial invasion in 2022 effectively destroyed the core of Russia's professional contract-based army, including its most experienced NCOs and junior officers. To sustain the war, the Kremlin has resorted to a series of desperate measures, including a chaotic partial mobilization, the large-scale recruitment of convicts, and offering significant financial incentives to attract volunteers. These new recruits often receive only a few weeks of rudimentary training before being thrown into high-intensity combat as part of human wave attacks, leading to persistent and well-documented problems with low morale, poor discipline, and a general unwillingness to fight. Strategic and reputational embarrassment, a series of debacles. Beyond the quantifiable losses, the war has been a series of profound strategic embarrassments that have exposed the Russian military's deep-seated institutional flaws. The Kyiv offensive, a failure of combined arms. The initial assault on Kyiv was a textbook example of a doctrinal plan collapsing upon contact with reality. The operation was a classic deep battle concept, a VDV air assault on Hostomel Airport that would create an air bridge to support a rapid armoured thrust to seize the capital within 72 hours. Every element of this plan failed. The VDV troopers were met with fierce Ukrainian resistance and, lacking support, were decimated. The massive armoured columns advancing from the north, infamously including the 40-mile convoy, were crippled by a complete logistical breakdown that left vehicles out of fuel, ammunition, and food just tens of kilometres into their offensive. The operation was a catastrophic failure of basic, combined arms coordination, planning, and intelligence. The inability to achieve air superiority. One of the most significant failures of the war has been the inability of the numerically and technologically superior VKS to establish air superiority over Ukraine. Doctrinally, the first priority in any modern conflict is to destroy the enemy's air defences. The VKS completely failed in this task. Its initial attempts at suppression of enemy air defences were sporadic and ineffective, allowing Ukraine's mobile air defence network to survive and remain lethal. The causes for this failure can clearly be demonstrated by a lack of pilot training, a shortage of precision-guided munitions, and an institutional inability to plan and execute complex air operations. The loss of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship on April 14, 2022 was a symbolic and strategic blow that resonated globally. The guided missile cruiser was struck and sunk by 2 Ukrainian-made Neptune anti-ship missiles. The incident revealed a shocking level of incompetence. Analysis suggests a chain of negligence was responsible for the loss. The ship's crew failed to detect the incoming missiles, suggesting its radar systems were inactive or its operators were poorly trained. Once the ship was hit, damage control efforts were so ineffective that a fire was allowed to reach its ammunition magazines, leading to a catastrophic explosion. These debacles were not independent events, but nodes in a web of systematic dysfunction. The sheer scale of the failures, vehicles with rotted tires, soldiers without food, and a flagship unable to defend itself, they are the predictable outcome of decades of systematic corruption that hollowed out the military's real capabilities. The Russian military that invaded Ukraine was not the force displayed in Red Square parades. It was a Potemkin military, a brittle facade of strength that shattered upon its first contact with the harsh reality of high-intensity warfare. In conclusion, the Russian Federation's special military operation has been a strategic own goal of historic proportions. It has failed to achieve any of its primary political objectives, resulted in catastrophic Russian casualties, consumed a vast portion of its national wealth, and triggered a wave of NATO expansion that has left Russia more strategically isolated than at any point since the Cold War. Before February 2022, Russia's most powerful foreign policy tool was the perceived might of its modernized military. The threat of a swift, decisive conventional intervention was a lever used to intimidate neighbors and project power across the globe. The war in Ukraine has played this card, only to reveal it as a bluff. The invasion has demystified and degraded Russian conventional military power for a generation. The staggering losses in experienced personnel and modern equipment cannot be quickly replaced, and the Russian defense industry, beset by sanctions, struggle to regenerate force for decades to come. The image of a sophisticated professional force has been replaced by the reality of a poorly led, inadequately trained, and logistically brittle army that resorts to brutal, attritional tactics out of an inability to do anything else. While Russia remains a formidable nuclear power, its ability to coerce and intimidate through the threat of conventional force has been drastically and perhaps permanently undermined. The greatest strategic loss for Moscow in this conflict is not any particular piece of Ukrainian territory, but the irreversible exposure of the profound weakness that lay behind its carefully constructed facade of strength. This has fundamentally altered the security architecture of Europe and will shape the contours of international relations for decades to come. Thank you all for watching.